Would you open your Bibles with me to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14? We've been slowly working our way through Mark from the beginning now, coming up on a year and a half. We're approaching the end. We're looking at verses 53 to 65. You can see I've titled the sermon this morning, The Silence of the Lamb, as a kind of play on a famous movie with Anthony Hopkins, or actually a really disturbing one, where he plays a cannibalistic serial killer, just to grasp attention, and it looks like it worked. Follow along with me as I read, starting in verses 53, and then we'll jump into the text. And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. And Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, but not made with hands.' Yet even in this their testimony didn't agree." And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But he remained silent and made no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." And the guards received him blows. Troy Davis and Sylvester Coles were arguing in a parking lot in 1989, small town in Georgia. Suddenly, Coles began to argue with and attack a homeless man. There was an off-duty police officer that saw the scuffle. He came over to help. And suddenly, out of nowhere, somebody pulled out a .38 and killed the off-duty police officer. Police came, investigators questioning what had happened. Coles had even admitted to having a .38 on him that night. But the prime suspect in the case was Davis. And actually, a trial began where 9 witnesses came forward, scant physical evidence, 9 eyewitnesses to say that they saw him do it. And in 1991, they convicted Davis guilty, and the punishment was death. And the world was outraged. Many people came forward. It was an international outcry at this incredible injustice. 7 of the original 9 witnesses recanted, actually. They took back their statements and said, "We were pressured into saying this about Davis." There was outrage. President Jimmy Carter, even he called for the sentence to be overturned and for Davis to be released. The Pope Benedict XVI. Tons of international lobbyist organizations, Amnesty International, celebrities, 51 members of Congress, everyone, to no avail. And on September 19th, 2011, in his last appeal, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles denied his clemency. 2 days later, on September 21st, late in the evening, Davis was executed by lethal injection. And when I think about this incredible injustice against Troy Davis, for no other reason than the hatred and evil of wicked men who despised him and sentenced him to death because of the color of his skin, when Davis was black and Coles was white, I can't help but think about the even greater and infinitely more injustice that was carried out against Jesus, the Son of God. It is horrible what happened to Davis. He was innocent, empirically speaking, by evidence of the crime. And he didn't deserve death. But Jesus was even more innocent. Jesus was not only innocent in the courts of men, but he was innocent in the court of God, a claim that only he alone could make. He was the sinless, spotless Lamb of God. And yet he was condemned to die a death like a criminal. Because the Jewish religious leaders hated him. They despised him. They were jealous of his oratory. They were jealous of his knowledge of the scriptures. They were jealous of his power to teach and to preach and of his popularity with the people and of the crowds. They were a threat. Jesus was a threat to their position, to their power, to their prestige, and they would do anything possible to see him dead, including bringing false charges and witnesses against him. By whatever means possible, to be rid of this imposter, this threat to their power. The difference between Davis and Jesus is that Davis had many people in the world lobbying for him. He had friends in powerful places, ex-presidents, the Pope, archbishops, celebrities, lawmakers, millions of people crying out. His family and friends with him. Jesus was all alone. He had nobody with him. His friend and close companion betrayed him. The rest of the disciples abandoned him. He was all alone, with no one beside him, nobody to take up his defense, nobody to lobby for him. And he didn't even lobby or defend for himself. He was silent. He silently submitted to the will of God and God's plan of salvation, because he knew that going to the cross and having this death sentence handed over to him and him being handed over to be crucified was the only way to save and to reconcile sinners to God. And he was determined to do it. Out of love for us, because it was the only way. It was the only way. And as guilty as the religious leaders of Israel are of directly handing Jesus over to be killed, his blood is on their hands. We are not guiltless in this. Every single human being has a part to play in the sentencing and in the execution of Jesus. Do you know why? Because it was our sin that made it necessary. It was because of my sin and your sin that Jesus had to die and hang on that cross. And we need to remember that every single day of our lives, that it would drive us more to gratitude and greater obedience and appreciation and affection for him who did this for us willingly, taking all the abuse and injustice. That's what we're going to look at. And by way of review, before we jump into verse 53, for those of you who haven't been with us, we are now deep into the Passion narrative. This last section of the Gospel of Mark, which is one continuous story about the last week, Jesus' final days on earth, and the scenes just flow one after another after another. It's one big story. Jesus has just been in the garden. We've seen that. He was in the garden, anticipating the horrors that lie ahead of him. Yes, the physical horrors and pain of the cross and the tortures before the cross, but even more than that, it was experiencing the full fury and weight of God's wrath on his shoulders on that cross. thinking about the prospect of the first time in his eternal human existence to be separated and cut off from God, to feel the displeasure and the wrath of God when he felt nothing but perfect love and unity and mutual acceptance. And the thought of that terrified him in his flesh as a man, because he was a man, as he was God. So much so that he was anxious, he was stressed, he was trembling, he was shaking, he was sweating, even sweating blood. We saw that. And he throws himself on his face, falls to the floor, bows his head before the Father, and begs him for divine strength and enablement. Crying out with tears, sweating blood, and even contemplates for a second in his flesh, if possible, that this cup of suffering might pass from him. But he knows it can't. He knows that this is the way, the only way. And so in spite of temptation, in spite of his weakness in the flesh, in spite of demonic opposition, in spite of satanic schemings trying to prevent him from going to the cross because he knew what Jesus' death would accomplish on the cross, he's resolute. And as God, he stands up and he goes to meet his destiny and his betrayer head on as Judas arrives with the band of guards to arrest him. And everything he said that night and predicted begins to happen. We saw that. Judas betrays him with a kiss. The rest of the disciples, the 11, abandon him. They run away scared for their lives, exactly as Jesus predicted. And then Mark continues the story here in verse 53. And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. So they led Jesus to the high priest here. Mark doesn't name him, but John and Matthew do. His name's Caiaphas. Caiaphas is the high priest. He is the high priest who'd been holding that office from about 18 to 36 AD during this time. And he had taken that office when the previous high priest, his father-in-law actually, Annas, was deposed of his throne by Pilate in AD 15. So that's where he's at. They lead him to Caiaphas' house. But actually, he doesn't go there first. And John tells us this in his account in John 18, 13 to 14, and then again in 19 to 23. He tells us that the guards first led him to Annas' house, which shows that Annas was still exercising tremendous influence over the religious leadership in Israel, even though he was not technically holding the office of the high priest whom only one person could hold. It was Caiaphas, his son-in-law. He was still the architect behind this whole scheme. And so they bring Jesus to him first to see if this most brilliant and most respected high priest could drum up some phony charges against Jesus and find some blasphemy, something to try him with. And so he questions Jesus, John says, about him and about his disciples. And Jesus says, I've been teaching publicly since the beginning of my ministry in synagogues and most recently in the temple in Jerusalem. You can ask my disciples, you can ask the crowds. I have nothing to hide. Everything I've taught is out in the open. You don't need to ask me. And then the guard, one of the temple guards, one of the high priest, Annas' guards, strikes him and says, he hits him, says, that's no way to talk to the high priest. And then they send him back to Caiaphas, right here in verse 53. So he's before them now. And then Mark pauses for a second, as we've seen he so often does, and he interrupts the flow of the narrative of the story by inserting another story. And he tells us about Peter here, who'd been following along. And he does this a lot. Remember, he sandwiches when he likes to have two stories where they both mutually interpret each other and kind of prove a grander and even larger point. And in this case, it's the contrast between Peter's faithlessness and the denial, which we'll look at next week as the second slice of that sandwich, contrasted with Jesus' perfect faithfulness and submission to the will of God to do exactly what God's called him to do. So he gives us a hint of what's going to follow next week. Oh, wow, Peter. Looks like Peter was right. Maybe we were wrong about Peter. Maybe he really is better than the rest of them. He said, you would never desert or abandon Jesus, and at least, he's following along here. He first did run away, and then when he saw the guards stop chasing him and they were going the other direction, then he stopped and started following them at a distance to see where they would be leading Jesus. He's there in the courtyard of the high priest. He had a big residence. It was almost like a palace. He's in the courtyard. See later that Jesus must be on the second floor, right? Because in verse 66, it says, and as Peter was below in the courtyard, we're going to see that next week, so he must have been outside in the courtyard, kind of like we have here. And right now, Jesus, the Sanhedrin, and the high priest are on the second floor of his mansion. Verse 55. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And here we see the wicked intent and motive of the Sanhedrin and of the high priest here. Everything's backward. There's no justice here. They have already passed the verdict and the sentence, death. Now they're just looking for charges to substantiate what they had already planned. And they had been planning this since the beginning of Jesus' ministry, hadn't they? Since Mark 3:6, all the way in Galilee, it says they sought a way to destroy him. And then he came to Jerusalem, and he started teaching in the temple. And when he cleared it in fury and started overturning the tables of the money changers and of the animal sellers because he was infuriated that the religious leadership had corrupted the temple of God, which was a house of prayer, into a place of corrupt business, they said they were enraged and they wanted to kill him. And they started planning to kill him and looking for a perfect opportunity to kill him. But they said, we can't do it during the Passover, during the festival, lest we create an uprising with the crowd. Jesus was very popular with the people. So they were waiting for the perfect moment. And suddenly that perfect moment arrives when one of Jesus' own disciples, Judas, comes to them and says, I'm going to give you insider information as to his whereabouts when he's outside of the city, away from the crowds, cover of the night, where you can find him, arrest him, and do what you will with him. They salivate at this opportunity, their eyes light up, and they seize that in the garden. They had already condemned him to death long before this hearing, this trial. This is a kangaroo court. There's no justice here. It's like an ancient lynching through cover of the night with torches and hooded masked men. There's no justice here. And they were looking for witnesses against him. Nothing about this is just, even by their own standards. You see, the Jews at this point, they had an oral law, an oral tradition on top of the 5 books of Moses, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They had not yet written it down or codified it into the Mishnah, which would happen less than 2 centuries later after this night. But in that, they had certain customs that they would follow. And everything about what they were doing at Jesus' trial was a violation of their own standards. Because the Mishnah says they weren't allowed to have trials at night. The Mishnah says a verdict or an acquittal could be passed one day, but the conviction has to be the next day. The Mishnah says that you have to strongly admonish witnesses to tell the truth. The Mishnah says that all questionable evidence is completely disqualified. And the Mishnah says that a trial, a capital trial, could only be held in one of 3 places in Jerusalem. And one of those places is not the high priest's house in the middle of the night. And it also says the only capital offense as far as blasphemy is concerned, that specific charge of blasphemy, is pronouncing and saying the divine name, God's covenant name, as he introduced himself to Moses at the burning bush, right? Yahweh. And they violate every single one of these details here in this trial. It's at night. It's at the high priest's house. They not only have a verdict, but they sentence him. He's convicted that same night rather than the next day. Instead of encouraging true testimony, they have false witnesses, which they bust in the middle of the night. And they're using contradictory, self-refuting evidence, which didn't qualify by their own standards. We're really seeing how rigged this all is from the very beginning. In the middle of the night, bringing in tens, dozens of witnesses, one after another, and they can't even agree with each other. You see, were they trying to honor the Old Testament law, which required at least 2 witnesses to confirm a capital sentence? Maybe. But they couldn't even find any. The idea is that the stories are all over the place. And Mark gives us just such an example of how these stories didn't add up. Look how he continues in verse 57. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.'" That's a serious charge. Destroy the temple. The temple was the most important place in all Jerusalem. The temple was the center of their religion, of their worship, of their culture, of their history. It's a big charge. It would be an attack against God. The temple was God's house in the eyes of the Sanhedrin and the high priest, right? And it would be an attack against them as the ones who are the stewards over God's house, the temple. They would take this charge very seriously. The problem is, their testimonies didn't agree. And their testimonies didn't agree because Jesus never said that at all. He did imply that in his clearing of the temple when he overturned the tables of the money changers and the animal sellers. He did imply that destruction was coming, and it did come in AD 70, and he predicted that explicitly shortly after in the Olivet Discourse in Mark 13. We saw that. But he never said, "I will destroy the temple." Those words never came out of his mouth. He did say, "A temple would be destroyed." And the operative word here is "a." And maybe that's what they're conflating. If you turn to John chapter 2, in John chapter 2, after the wedding at Cana, Jesus is talking to the Jews, some of the religious leaders. In verse 18, and John says this, "So the Jews said to him, 'What sign do you show us for doing these things?' Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.'" See the difference? Jesus was talking about himself, his body as the temple. And in case that's not clear, the narrator here, John, makes that abundantly clear. Look what he continues to say in verse 20. "The Jews then said, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple.'" See, they didn't get it. "And you will raise it up in 3 days?" Verse 21. "But he was speaking about the temple of his body." He was never talking about the Jewish temple. Back to Mark 14. That's why Mark calls these eyewitnesses false. Because Jesus never said that. False testimony after false testimony, contradictory, self-refuting. And the high priest has had enough of this. He's had enough of this. It looks like we're not going to find 2 corroborating witnesses enough to sentence and condemn Jesus to death. So now I got to take matters into my own hands. If we can't find 2 witnesses to convict him, then we got to get him to incriminate himself. We have to get him to say something that we can then use against him to condemn him to death, and that's exactly what he does. Look at verse 60. "And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' What are you going to say for yourself? This is a dramatic gesture, by the way, when the high priest in their hearings or their courts would finally stand up and taken it upon himself rather than the rest of the Sanhedrin, which is the ruling council of Israel, right? 70 members plus the high priest. And the Sanhedrin was comprised of chief priests, scribes of Pharisaic or Sadducean tradition, and elders of Israel. And then the high priest, so 70 plus 1. When he stands up now in the middle of a hearing to directly cross-examine and interrogate a suspect, the person on trial, that's a big deal. He's taking matters into his own hands. And he questions him directly. Aren't you going to defend yourself? Aren't you going to say something against these eyewitnesses who are accusing you? Don't you have anything to say? Do you not care what they're saying about you? And of course, Jesus, like anyone on the one hand, you don't even need to dignify false testimony with a response. He doesn't. Verse 61. But he remained silent and made no answer. Anyone would remain silent in that circumstance. Was he silent because the evidence and the testimony was self-refuting? Yes. Was he silent because he didn't want to say anything that could and would be used against him in the court to try and to condemn him to death? Absolutely not. Jesus was not dodging or ducking his destiny and his death. He was taking it head on. He was silent because he is the suffering Messiah of Isaiah 53, who was crushed for the iniquities and the sins of you and me, who bore the weight and fury of God's wrath on his shoulders, who was chastised to make us at peace with God, who died to make many righteous, and who Isaiah 53:7 says this, also of the suffering servant Messiah, in predicting Jesus. Turn to Isaiah 53:7. We've been looking at this passage a lot because it is the most explicit and clearest prediction of Jesus and his work on the cross in the place of sinners in all of the Old Testament, and I would argue even all the Bible, as far as the specificity with which it describes what he's going to do in his substitutionary death. This is what it says in verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. That's why he stayed silent. He stayed silent in fulfillment of the prophecy of Scripture about what he would do when facing trial and false accusation and false testimony against him. He stayed silent as the suffering servant Messiah. What a contrast. He stayed silent. He willingly renounced his rights and the freedom to defend himself. Completely unlike you and I today, right? How quickly do we respond when somebody accuses us? Do we take it in silence? How dare you speak to me this way? Who are you to accuse me of this and that and of that lie and the other? I would do no such thing. I've never done anything like that. How dare you impugn my character, which is above reproach? That is an insult to slander me like that. Who do you think you are? We're quick to do that. That's our first instinct. We're quick to take up our rights, too, especially in this part of the world, in America, of which we have many rights and freedoms. How dare you impugn and trespass upon my freedom of religion and expression? It is my inalienable right. You can't tell me what to do and what not to do. I deserve my fair day in court. It is my constitutional right. yet, we are all guilty of the most unimaginable crimes in the court of God. Sinning against God. Sin so great, so ugly, so wicked in the eyes of God that it is worthy of eternal judgment in hell. If anyone had the right to take up his own defense and stand up for himself, it was Jesus, right? Because he truly was the only one without sin. So he could have said that. He could have put them on blast. He could have taken up his right. He could have reminded them that he has no sin, that he's not deserving of this, false testimony, false witness, mockery, beatings, spittings. I don't deserve any of this. You guys are all wrong. And you're all sinners. And he would have been right and true in saying all of that, but he stayed silent. Because that's what Scripture said he would do. And he set the example of humble obedience, resolute to do what he came down from heaven to do, to rescue and to ransom sinners. And he did so silently, and he handed himself over willingly, passively. He didn't take up his right. The high priest sees that's not working. Jesus still remains silent. He's not addressing any of the accusations. So now he takes it a step further. Now he wants to ask Jesus a question directly to incriminate him. And it's a loaded question. It's a loaded question because even though he doesn't believe it, he knows a lot of people in the crowds believe it. And he probably thinks at this point for sure that Jesus does believe this of himself as far as his identity. And so he asks him plainly. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And by blessed here, this is what they call a circumlocution, where they pick a different word because they don't want to pronounce or say the name of God. And they had many of these names or alternate titles for God because it was blasphemous for them to say the divine name, right? Yahweh. So one of the names that they would say instead, they would substitute for that is the Blessed One or the Blessed. And that's what he's doing here. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. I am. I am. And one day, you are going to see me, the Son of Man and Son of God, seated at the right hand of power and majesty and glory, with all authority under heaven and earth, when every knee will be forced to bow before me. And I am coming back to save and to judge. On the clouds of heaven. Jesus here is alluding to two passages which we've been looking at a lot in the Passion narrative because they've been coming up, not the least of which is Psalm 110:1, which he already used and to confuse and to question and to challenge the Jewish people's understanding of Messiah back in chapter 12:36, right? When he quotes Psalm 110:1, when he says, how can the Messiah be David's son if David in the Spirit says, the Lord said to my Lord, Messiah, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And the idea of the right hand of power there, that was the position of prominence and prestige in regal terms, in royal terms. To sit at the right hand of the king, you were in the highest position of power. In the same way, to sit at the ultimate right hand, which is the right hand of God, the sovereign of the universe, there is no more exalted or greater place to be than the right hand of God. And that's what Jesus is saying here. And even when he says the right hand of power, you see the capital P there, he's doing exactly what the high priest just did. It's a circumlocution, just so that he won't even give them any inclination in the slightest to accuse him of blasphemy. He doesn't even use the divine name of God. He just, the power, the euphemism of that, just like the high priest. And the other allusion, that Son of Man, coming on the clouds of heaven. That's from Daniel 7:13. And do you know what Daniel 7:13 says? We looked at this a little bit in the Olivet Discourse, 7:13 to 14. Daniel here has a vision. It's an eschatological vision of what he describes as this. Verse 13, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, that's God, and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples and nations and languages should serve him, and his dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Jesus is saying, this is me. That's who I am. I am the Son of Man. All judgment, all glory, all majesty, all power is going to be given to me at the right hand of God by God, and an everlasting kingdom and an everlasting dominion of all nations, all tribes, all tongues, all languages of people who will serve and worship me, and I'm coming back to judge and to save. He's saying, you may be sitting in judgment of me now, but I'm coming back then, and I'm going to be sitting in judgment of you. And they get it. They understood what he was saying here. Look at their response in Mark 14. In verse 63. And the high priest tore his garments and said, what further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. They would tear their garments like this. They had this inner garment that was kind of like an undershirt. And when they heard blasphemy, or they would actually do this sometimes in grief and in mourning, when they were really angry, when they were outraged, they would just tear it like that. And in the Mishnah, there's actually a clause specifically in the context of a hearing or of a court where judges would stand up in kind of lockstep. When they heard a blasphemy, they would just tear their. And this is exactly what the high priest does. He is outraged. He's outraged because he understands exactly what Jesus has just claimed. And it is an abomination in his eyes. He tears his shirt. What more need of witnesses? This is outlandish blasphemy. We don't need witnesses, 1, 2. We have everyone here that has just heard him incriminate himself. He has condemned himself to death. What should we do with him? And you could probably imagine the scene. He's whipping the rest of the Sanhedrin into a frenzy. What should we do? They're chanting, death, death. He deserves to die. And then verse 64. They all condemned him to death. All of them. They condemned him to death. They couldn't execute the death, the punishment themselves, because they didn't have the authority. Remember, Israel was a vassal state to Rome, and Rome had given them certain power and influence through the governor, in this case Pilate, the Sanhedrin. He'd let them rule in smaller, petty religious matters that he had no interest at all to be involved in, so he let them do that. And the same with the political courts and Herod, right, the puppet king. But when it came to capital punishment, only Rome could execute that. And so they're still coming up with a way to hand him over and to try to convince Pilate to carry out this condemnation, this death sentence that they passed. You have heard his blasphemy. What blasphemy exactly did Jesus commit here? They are adamant that he's committed a blasphemy. It certainly wasn't saying the divine name, which we saw was a capital offense. What was the blasphemy? The blasphemy was his claim to be the Son of God, which is to say his claim to be God. They are one and the same. I understand there's some scholars even today who are skeptical about what exactly the Sanhedrin here and the high priest understood by Jesus' claim in his sentence here to say, I'm the Son of Man, I'm going to come on the clouds of glory at the right hand of power. Well, he didn't necessarily mean that. And I understand what they're saying in some of the reservations, in so much as the title Son of God, in that day, to them, did not carry all of the rich theological connotations that it does for us today on this side of the cross. because we have the fuller New Testament, and we hear what Paul in specific has to say about Jesus and his eternal divine sonship with God, and his nature and his purpose with God. We have all that. So we understand what we mean, what Paul means, what the New Testament means when they say Jesus, the Son of God. Of course, they quite didn't have that full understanding. But even if they didn't understand Jesus as directly claiming divinity here, they did understand something. They well understood his claim to be the Messiah here, at the very least. And they knew that the Messiah was a supremely exalted figure, right? From some of the passages we just looked at, who alone was exalted to the right hand of God, the most powerful position, glorious position, majestic position in the universe. And in order for God to raise someone up and exalt him to his right hand, that person has to be someone like God. At the very least, a quasi-like figure. For sure they understood Messiah to be like that, a quasi-divine figure. Had to be. Why would God raise a mere man to such a lofty position of dominion and kingship over the entire universe? They got that. And it was incredibly blasphemous to them. There was no greater blasphemy in their eyes than for a human being, a man, to claim equality with God. And it's the same in Judaism today. And in Islam, actually. They are two sides of the same coin. I was taking an Uber recently, and I got picked up. And nice driver. Started talking, conversing. Told him where he was dropping me off was church. I was on my way here. Told him I'm the pastor of a church. He said, "Oh no, that's nice, great." We started talking, and he was responding. Could tell he had a Middle Eastern accent. And I asked him if he was religious or he had a faith. He said, "Yes, I'm Muslim, but I'm not practicing. I love all of the teachings of the Quran. It's a religion of peace, and it's wonderful. And one day soon in the future, I'm going to start following it very closely when I have more time." And then he says, "Oh, actually the Quran and the Bible are very similar. There's a lot of similar teachings." And I knew where he was going with this. I'd spoken to a lot of Muslims in my day, trying to draw common ground. Very similar. Especially when it comes to comparing Islam with Judaism and Christianity. "Oh, in the Old Testament, it's almost exactly the same," which is a huge oversimplification, because the only crossover and parallels which are similar, because the Quran took exactly out of the Old Testament, is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, right? The Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, except they are wrong on the huge overarching covenant of promise, the first one God made with Abraham, in which the new covenant finds itself, because they take the promise to come through Ishmael rather than Isaac. But anyways, he says, it's very similar teachings, and we actually believe in Jesus too. We believe Jesus was a great teacher, a very moral man, he was a great prophet, second only to Muhammad, and we even believe that Jesus is coming back. And they do, by the way, believe in the Quran. They believe in the second coming of Jesus. And he continues saying, "We believe he's coming back, and when he comes back, he's going to come back and he's going to correct all of the Christians who were wrong about him and believed that he was the Son of God and believed the rest of the New Testament letters, and he's going to put them all right." Because they actually believe the Gospels, but not the New Testament. And I'll tell you why in a minute as the conversation unfolds. Not the letters. I said, that is the difference, isn't it? The fundamental difference between Christianity and Islam. Because if I'm wrong, I'm going to hell. But if you're wrong, you're going to hell. And I said, that's the difference. Christianity claims the exclusivity of forgiveness of sin and salvation in Jesus alone. Because he is the sinless Son of God who could have paid the penalty of sin and conquered death. This is exclusive and fundamental to the faith. And he says this, and I know they think this is kind of the trump card if you're ever having a conversation with them. Show me where in the Gospels Jesus ever claimed to be the Son of God. Exhibit A, at his trial, according to Mark, Matthew, and John, he claimed it. Even if the religious leaders didn't necessarily understand it as quite that expansive. Jesus certainly did. As God, in his own mind, you think he wasn't fully conscious of his divinity and eternal sonship and equality in essence as God? Of course he was. That's a claim right there. Or how about in John 8:58? He's having a conversation with the Pharisees, the religious leaders, talking about Abraham. Saying, Father Abraham would have longed to see my day, the day of the Messiah. He knew who he was. He was fully conscious of his divine sonship. And they said, what are you talking about? Abraham would have longed to see your day. He lived 1,000 years before you. You're barely 33 years old. And he said this in verse 58. Truly, truly, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. And he uses the name that God uses to introduce himself to Moses in the burning bush. I am. You said, no, that's not a claim of divinity. Really? Because it says the next sentence, the Pharisees were enraged. They picked up stones to stone him to death. Yeah, that's a claim to divinity. Jesus knew who he was. And various times in his ministry, he made that abundantly clear to those who have an open heart and who are willing to see and believe. Let alone all the other divine prerogatives that he exercised throughout his ministry. The miracle work, the miracles that only God could do, he did again and again and again, more than any other prophet and all of the prophets in the Old Testament combined. Not to mention the fact that he accepted worship. None of the Old Testament prophets ever accepted worship. They would never do such a thing. They knew worship was reserved exclusively to God. Jesus accepted worship. Various acts of worship towards him in his lifetime. But it's a stumbling block. Jesus' divinity, his divine sonship, his equality with God is a stumbling block for Muslims. And it is a stumbling block in Judaism to this day. The Jews won't accept Jesus because they don't believe that he is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies, but he is the fulfillment of that, and he is so much more. He is the promised Messiah, but he's way more than they even imagined. He is God, and that's unacceptable to them. And the Muslims won't accept Jesus as anything more than a man, a teacher, a prophet, because they believe God is too holy to have any other. There's only one God, and he could never have a son, and that's blasphemous to say that. And there's a lot of other people who stumble over Jesus' divine sonship, over his divinity, and they don't want to believe in him because they want to continue being the Lord of their own lives. Because once you recognize and admit that Jesus is God, now suddenly you're obligated to follow him and to surrender the reins of your life to him. And they don't want that. And that's why there's a huge part of me that in a way wishes there was another way. So that as many people as possible could be forgiven of their sins and rescued and redeemed and have the hope of salvation in heaven. But there is no other way. There is no other way. There is no other way but by repenting of your sin, understanding that you are a sinner from birth, by nature born into it, eternally separated from God, and due the rightful wrath and full fury of God for eternity in hell, but he saved you from that. He made a way out of gracious love and gratitude, which was part of his infinite plan, by the way. The triune God Father, Spirit, and Son planning this together to send the Son to pay the penalty in the place of sinners. And all you have to do is believe. That's all they have to do. You don't have to keep countless laws and regulations and traditions like they do in Islam and in Judaism, crushing themselves with the weight of human law, which cannot earn yourself right standing with God. It is impossible. Why do all those things? I tell them all the time. Isn't there a part of you that would just like to believe that there's nothing you could do, but God did everything for you? Isn't that an incredible message? Who wouldn't want to believe that? But a hard heart can't believe that. Unless the Spirit does that work in your heart and produces faith, you will not believe in the gospel of grace because it's such an attractive message in that sense. Or you don't want to believe it because you struggle to admit you're a sinner. And you really deep down believe that if you do this, you can check. I can earn forgiveness and right standing with God. That's pride. That's what stops people from coming to Christ and believing this gospel of grace. It's saying, I don't need grace. All I got to do is this long checklist. 603 long in the case of the oral tradition from the Jews. I just got to keep them all perfectly. Even that you couldn't do was the whole point. So they condemned him as deserving death. In verse 65, some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, prophesy. And the guards received him with blows. Like the suffering servant of Isaiah, who talks about him a lot. He says in Isaiah 56, that's Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6, this is what he says. I gave my back to those who strike, and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and from spitting. Spitting. The universal sign of scorn and humiliation and degradation and disgrace. They spat in the face of God. And then they covered his face, covered his eyes, blindfolded him, and started striking him with their fists and striking him with clubs, saying, prophesy. And Matthew and Luke finish the sentence, prophesy for what? They say, prophesy, tell us who hit you. That's mocking. And it's incredibly ironic that they are asking him to prophesy who hit him. And they're spitting on him. Exactly as he had just months earlier, and for us in Mark 10, in his third passion prediction, prophesied that they would do. Look what he says in verse 34. Right? He says, the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes. They will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. They're mocking him as a prophet. And he had just predicted that they would do this. And this is the Sanhedrin and the high priest doing this, by the way, when it says the sum. We know that right at the end. It says, then they handed him over to the guards, the temple guards, and they continued to do the same. When the religious leaders, the pious and the holy and the best in Israel had finished punching him and beating him and spitting on him and mocking him, when they've had their fill of executing and taking out all their outrage because of his supposed blasphemy, then they handed him over to the temple guards to continue. Guards continued. They did the same. Jesus was the victim of the greatest injustice ever committed in human history. Because he was the only truly innocent man in history. Innocent in human courts and law? Absolutely. But even more importantly, innocent in the highest court of all, the court of God. Blameless. But the Jewish leadership, they're not the only ones that have Jesus' blood on their hands, are they? Yes, they're the ones directly responsible. And they say that. We're going to see that shortly when they rouse the crowds to start chanting the same, trying to convince Pilate, because Pilate doesn't necessarily want to. And they say, let his blood be on our hands, and on our children, and on our children's children. But Pilate was also guilty. Judas was also guilty for betraying him and handing him over, a close companion and follower of Jesus, like you and like me. And you and I are guilty of having Jesus' blood on our hands because we committed the sin necessary for his death to happen. And we're just like a lot of these characters in our own ways. Right? It was our craftiness and our scheming and our plotting, like the religious leaders, as we do this in life, that made Jesus' death necessary. And it was our duplicity, our deceitfulness, our betrayals of Jesus and of others that made his death necessary. It was our cowardice and our failing faith, which fails often if we're honest, that made Jesus' perfect, exemplary life of faith and death necessary. Our wishy-washy, flip-flopping faith like Pilate, our running away in fear and trembling and cowardice like Peter, our hatred towards others, and before God came down and saved us, our hatred towards God, just like the crowds who cry out, blood on our hands, that was what made Jesus' death necessary. It was our mockery of God and of others around us, when we treat them with indignity, that made Jesus' death necessary. That's why Jesus stayed silent. He willingly and passively submitted to the plan of God because he knew it was the only way to give us and to save us.